Welcome to a special bonus episode of the Georgia Politics Podcast. Calling in via phone today, we have Josh Sharpe. He is a writer for Atlanta Magazine. The title of his piece, Why Are So Many People Getting Rare Cancers in This Small Georgia Town? Josh, thanks for calling in, and thanks for making time to come on the show today.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
So before we really get into it, I'd recommend everybody listening to go give the piece a read. Obviously, that's going to enhance the experience of what we're going to talk about, but it is a remarkable piece of journalism that features Waycross, Georgia. So before we get into the details of the story, Josh, can you give us a little bit on your background and how you got into what you're doing today?
Well, I'm from Waycross, and I grew up, very proud of Waycross, but I ended up moving because there weren't as many options for a young journalist there as there were up in Atlanta. So I came up here and started working for newspapers, and actually right now I'm a staff writer at the AJC.
Gotcha. So for this story, how did you initially get turned on to the idea for it?
Well, like most people from Waycross, back in 2016, 2015, and going into 2016, I was seeing news stories about the situation in Waycross. There was a bit of coverage from a Jacksonville TV station. Also, Georgia Health News was doing some coverage, and it was just very puzzling that we had 3 children in Waycross with rhabdomyosarcoma, which is this sort of intensely rare cancer. Only 350 children get it in America every year. In the state of Georgia, only about a dozen kids get it every year. Yet in this little speck of Georgia with far less than 1% of the population, we had 3 cases crop up in 3 months. We had another child that had Ewing sarcoma, which is even rarer. So it all seemed very strange. And as I was reading about this, and there were stories about the government was going to investigate, and something happened to me that I found to happen to a lot of people in Waycross. I started to think about someone who had died of cancer, and that was my mother. She died of a rare cancer in 2013. She had ocular melanoma, which is essentially skin cancer in the eye. And I began to wonder, is this maybe a way to find out whatever happened there? Because for a long time, I didn't think much about why she got that cancer, because I know from being, an adult that asking why someone got cancer is kind of a futile question typically, because it's extremely difficult to find out the answer unless they're a smoker or something, and she wasn't. But then this investigation raised this question, is it possible to find out why? So I decided, that this would be a good subject for me to look into for the story.
So what is it about Waycross? And I think it's obvious for those who have read the story, but, what is it about Waycross that maybe could have been causing these rare cases that you lay out in the story with companies that have closed down plants and things like that?
Well, something that I never really knew about, and a lot of people I know never really knew about, is that Waycross has an unusual amount of contaminated sites. We have 6 different state Superfund sites. We have 1 site that was scrutinized by the federal Superfund program. We have still other companies that have been criticized and fined for their environmental dealings. It all goes back to the railroad yard there. There is a massive, what they call railroad switching and maintenance yard, and it's the largest one in the southeastern United States. And it its history there dates back to 1880, which dates back farther than the city of Waycross. So to say that Waycross would not exist without this railroad yard is not an understatement. This railroad yard gave birth to Waycross. And then, of course, this investigation came along, and these concerns about the pollution at that railroad yard, made people wonder if not only did it create us, but is it now harming us? And the reason that the railroad yard is polluted is through the years they've used potentially dangerous chemicals and had methods of disposal that could have been better, to say the least. And some of this stuff is still in the ground, and they have a groundwater treatment system that is in place that has been trying to clean up this mess for the past 30 years, but they're not done. And it's not exactly clear when they'll be done, because it's a complex problem.
You just touched on something I wanted to get to, but there's a particular quote from the lead-in of the piece that stuck with me. I'll read it here. The implications of the investigation were vast. It forced the community to consider whether the industries that gave it life could now be taking lives back. That second sentence you just talked about a lot there, but the first one, the investigation. So what comes after these cases of this rare cancer start getting reported? I mean, you go through Department of Public Health and the federal level, but run us through the history of kind of what's been investigated there, and maybe sometimes where they've fallen short and can pick up in the future or anything like that.
Well, the most recent investigation was done by the ATSDR, which is an arm of the CDC, and they worked in concert with the Georgia Health Department to examine the railroad yard and a long-shuttered Atlanta gas light facility, which is next to the railroad yard. Actually, the investigation of the Atlanta gas light property is still ongoing. They're not done with that. I'll say that property is only about an acre, whereas the railroad yard is 755 acres. So that was the one that everyone in town, or a lot of people in town were most concerned about. And the ATSDR and the State Health Department spent about 2 years looking into data on what is it in the ground there, and what the tests have shown through the years about whether or not this water treatment, the groundwater treatment system that CSX has in place, is working or not. And they came to the conclusion that it is working and is keeping the contaminants on CSX's property. The reason that that's important is, like I said, Waycross grew out of this railroad yard, so all around the railroad yard is residential neighborhoods. So it's imperative that they keep that pollution on their property and not in those neighborhoods. And the investigators with the government found that the system seems to be working, and they can't find any connection between the pollution and these children who have, or in some cases had, this rare cancer. Two of them passed away, fortunately. And so that's the official word, I'll say that there are a lot of people in Waycross are not satisfied with the investigation, particularly for a couple reasons. One being the government used CSX's own data and didn't do new testing for this inquiry. Now, I will say on that, some of this data is historical. It comes from many years ago, so we can't go back in time and get data, so we have to rely on CSX for some of the data. But a lot of the folks in town wanted more testing. They wanted fresh, what they would call independent testing. And also, all four of these children's families told me that no official from the local, state, or federal government ever made any contact with them to ask them any questions to make to to try to figure out why they specifically got cancer. And that not only was offensive to the families, it also made them think that the investigation wasn't taken as seriously as it should have been.
There's a stark contrast in your story, and you touched on a little bit, between kind of the technical and the personal. Just in your process of going about writing it, was that something very intentional? And they almost go back and forth, like you're never in one side of this story for too long. Sometimes you're in somebody's living room, and other times you're getting a tour of the rail yard. Was that something intentionally you set out to do, or did just the timetable work out that way?
Well, I would say it's intentional. I mean, I think I needed to give you a tour of these sites that we're talking about, so you can get an idea of what goes on there. I also didn't want people to forget that, these are companies that do real business, that employ real people. They're not just some shadowy entity. They're very present in our community. And you say at one moment in the story we're in somebody's living room, the next moment we're, at the railroad yard. Well, you could walk out our front door and be at the railroad yard, Yeah, it's just right there. These two things are very tied together.
Sure.
In our community. And as far as the, going to the sites, I felt that this story needed to have grounding in the facts of what is in the ground, what are the concerns, what can this pollution do, what are the questions that we don't have answered. And one of the questions that we don't have answered, and certainly I'm not going to solve, is how do we find out what a cancer cluster is and what a cancer cluster isn't? Because if you look at cancer cluster investigations, by and large, they fail. They do not find evidence of a cancer cluster, even in these cases where it seems like they ought to. And the thing is, science just isn't there yet. It's extraordinarily difficult to find out why a person got cancer. It can cost millions of dollars. It can take years and years to find out why one person got cancer. Now, in a cancer cluster investigation, you've got to do that not only for one person, you've got to do it for a second person, a third person, maybe a third or fourth person. And, we as a society, for lack of a better word, we just aren't set up for that yet. So this is one thing that really frustrates, so many people, not just in Waycross, all over the country, all over the world, I'd wager, is that we are still so mystified by cancer as a people.
Well, I was going to mention something you just said there, which is you write about Waycross with a lot of love and obviously a lot of personal history, but the way it's described as this small town built around a single company that maybe shed some of its responsibility decades ago, it sounds like something that could be put on towns across the country. And even the Mayor John Knox says in your story, don't compare us to Flint, Michigan. And so it's almost like there is an implication there that they're like these other places of small towns where people have shed their responsibility. So do you think this story has more wide-reaching impact than just that small Georgia town?
Absolutely, yeah. I think this is certainly a national story because this story came out. I began hearing from people all over the country about their concerns about where they live and how they're seeing shades of things that go on in their hometown too. And what Waycross is going through is unfortunately not that unique. For a long time, all sorts of industries in our country used chemicals, products that in some cases they may not have known at the time were very dangerous, but nevertheless they used them, and we're still seeing the impact of it today. In the case of Waycross, one chemical I'll give you for example that was sort of the the chemical of most concern for regulators or for researchers, is called TCE, and TCE is an industrial degreaser. Essentially, you take like a piece of metal and dip it in TCE, and it would get the grease off of it. Well, at the railroad yard, they used this for many years and disposed of it in the ground in some cases. Well, it turns out years later that this stuff is toxic. It is a carcinogen. We all agree it's a carcinogen. CSX tells me they stopped using it, I believe they said in the 80s. But this stuff was used all over the world. And it was put into the ground all over the world for decades. And it doesn't just go away on its own. You've got to take it out. And, at Waycross, they've been working for over 30 years to take it out, and they still haven't gotten there. So I think that definitely tells us something about the world we live in, not just Waycross.
Before we wrap up, this is, a special episode of the Georgia Politics Podcast. So I want you to just quickly touch on maybe a role you think either local officials or the Department of Public Health, maybe an increased role in the future they can play, both to prevent things like this from happening again, and maybe in Waycross's particular case, ways we can, do a little bit better to get to the bottom of something like this.
Well, I don't want to tell anybody how to do their job. Well, I guess what I would say is, instead of that, maybe I could share something that's encouraging to me about the attitude of a lot of people in Waycross. That is how it's changed since this investigation started. For many years, we never talked about how polluted Waycross was. Many people didn't know how polluted Waycross was, myself included. And through the process of this investigation, we've all found out how polluted it is. And what we can do now is watch these properties that are polluted. We can do our best to watch other properties and make sure they don't become polluted. And if we can do those two things, then I think we've made a lot of progress as a community. And I think that, any other community could also learn from Waycross in that sense. Be aware of the pollution, be aware of the potential polluters, be aware of how dangerous these things could be, before it becomes too late.
Josh, thank you so much for making time for us this morning. We look forward to reading your future work and seeing if this investigation goes anywhere else, which I certainly hope it does.
Appreciate it.
The title of the piece is "Why Are So Many People Getting Rare Cancers in This Small Georgia Town?" The author is Josh Sharpe. You can find it on atlantamagazine.com. We will send it out on Twitter and in the show notes of this episode. Josh, thanks again, and this has been a special episode of the Georgia Politics Podcast.